delve into a more controversial topic for a moment, the lobotomy, a once prominent neurosurgical treatment for psychiatric and neurological disorders. Originating from the pioneering work of Portuguese neurologist António Egas Moniz, who shared the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine in 1949, the lobotomy involves severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. Despite its initial acclaim, the procedure quickly sparked debate due to its questionable efficacy and its irreversible effects. Join me as we delve into the rise, fall, and the lasting impact of this procedure, shedding light on a dark chapter in our medical history that continues to intrigue and unsettle. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, it's great to have you here again. For those who'd like to support the channel and enjoy ad-free videos, head on over to the Patreon. Link is in the description and the comments. And for those who want to help me in the algorithm, a like, comment, and subscribe certainly goes a long, long way. Without further ado, let's get into the topic for today: the history of lobotomies. At the dawn of the 20th century, mental hospitals saw an unprecedented influx of patients. Yet effective treatments remained elusive. It was against this backdrop that the lobotomy emerged, marking a dramatic departure from the pervasive sense of therapeutic despair that had dominated psychiatry since the late 1800s. This period witnessed the birth of various heroic treatments across Europe, a testament to the era's experimental spirit. These included malarial therapy for general paresis in 1917, deep sleep therapy in 1920, insulin shock therapy in 1933, followed by cardiazol shock therapy in 1934, and finally, electroconvulsive therapy in 1938. All of these treatments are indeed as terrifying as they sound. These innovative, albeit risky, therapies injected a newfound optimism into a field that had been languishing in pessimism, bolstering faith in the potential to cure mental illness in the efficacy of psychiatric methods. The success of these shock therapies, despite their considerable dangers, gradually accustomed psychiatrists to the idea of more aggressive medical interventions, paving the way for the eventual acceptance of the lobotomy. Joel Braslow, a clinician and historian, observed that starting with malarial therapy, psychiatric treatments increasingly targeted the brain itself, reflecting its growing importance as both the origin of the disease and the focus of the cure. Another renowned medical historian, Roy Porter, noted that the aggressive psychiatric treatments of the 30s and 40s reflected psychiatrists' earnest attempts to relieve the suffering of many patients in already overcrowded psychiatric hospitals. Yet it also underscored the limit that societal influence had on these patients to oppose the bold and sometimes hazardous treatments imposed by the doctors who rather treated the asylums as places for experiments Despite these significant risks, many at the time believed the outcomes of lobotomy to be positive, or at least preferable to the prospect of lifelong confinement in an institution. After all, they were certainly not the most pleasant places to take up residency in. For a time, the lobotomy was rather celebrated within the medical community as a viable last resort for those who were deemed beyond help. However, of course, the legacy of this procedure has darkened over time, and the more we know, the darker it gets. Once a procedure that was embraced by the doctors of mainstream medicine, it's now seen as a symbol of medical overreach, and a time where the rights of patients were egregiously violated, embodying the very essence of what we may term as medical barbarism. Prior to the 1930s, there were only sporadic instances where doctors, on their own initiative, ventured into uncharted territory. And one of these medical no-man's lands was brain surgery, particularly on patients that were classified as insane. A pivotal moment in this journey occurred in 1888, when Swiss psychiatrist Gottlieb Burckhardt embarked on what is widely recognized as the first concentrated foray into modern psychosurgery. Within the confines of the Swiss Privilegier Asylum, Burckhardt took a step by performing operations on 6 patients under his care, excising parts of their cerebral cortex. His decision to operate was underpinned by 3 prevailing beliefs about mental illness and its nexus within the brain function. Firstly, there was a consensus that mental disorders had an organic basis, manifesting from physical abnormalities within the brain itself. Secondly, the nervous system was conceptualized as an associationist network comprising a sensory input system, a central processing unit for information, also known as the association center, and a motor output system. Lastly, the brain was seen as a modular entity, with distinct mental functions tied to specific brain regions. Burckhardt posited that by surgically creating lesions in the brain areas identified as association centers, it may be possible to effect a behavioral transformation. This hypothesis was grounded in the observation that the mentally ill might suffer from excitations abnormal in quality, quantity, and intensity within sensory regions, which could then be erroneously transmitted to the motor areas, leading to mental disorders. Burckhardt, however, was cautious about operating directly on the sensory motor zones, fearing what he called grave functional disturbances. Instead, he aimed to disrupt the communication pathways by targeting the association centers, effectively isolating the motor region of the temporal lobe. By creating a ditch around it, as he called it, he hoped to sever the lines of communication, thereby alleviating the mental symptoms and distress they caused. This pioneering, though controversial, approach laid the groundwork for the evolution of psychosurgery, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the treatment of mental illness. With a focus on more mitigating the symptoms for those suffering from severe and untreatable conditions, rather than on achieving a complete cure, Burckhardt embarked on a groundbreaking yet contentious venture in December 1888. Armed with primitive surgical techniques and instruments, which at the time were cutting edge, no pun intended, he performed operations on 6 patients. By his own evaluation, the outcomes were decidedly mixed. 2 patients showed no improvement. 2 exhibited calmer behavior. 1 suffered from epileptic seizures and passed away shortly after the surgery, and 1 was considered improved. The complications from these operations were significant and included motor weakness, epilepsy, sensory aphasia, and what is termed as word deafness. Despite the mixed results, Burckhardt claimed a 50% success rate, which is rather generous considering his own observations. He then boldly shared his findings at the Berlin Medical Congress and through published reports in various medical journals. However, the reaction from the medical community was overwhelmingly negative. I wonder why. Well, this led him to cease all further surgical endeavors and drop the idea of the lobotomies completely. Well, you'd think that this was the end of it. Unfortunately, if you thought that, you're wrong. In stark contrast, the year 1912 witnessed Vladimir Bekhterev, a prominent Russian neurologist, and Ludwig Pusep, a younger Estonian neurosurgeon, reviewing various surgical procedures on the mentally ill with a generally positive outlook. However, when it came to psychosurgery, they specifically targeted Burckhardt's experiments for criticism, expressing astonishment that a medically trained professional could engage in what they saw as a fundamentally flawed practice. They declared these operations not only baseless, but perilous, questioning how Burckhardt, with all of his medical qualifications, could have proceeded with them in the first place. Although this critique did omit the fact that Pusep, the Estonian, himself had conducted similar surgeries just 2 years prior in 1910, attempting to section the cortex between the frontal and parietal lobes in 3 mentally ill patients, ultimately abandoning these efforts due to unsatisfactory incomes. Throwing stones in glass houses, it seems. This personal experience of his likely fueled the harsh criticism that was leveled at Burckhardt. Now, despite this initial disapproval, by 1937, Pusep's stance had likely evolved a little bit. He became increasingly convinced of the potential legitimacy of psychosurgery for treating mental disturbances. This change of heart saw him collaborating closely with the neurosurgical team at Racconigi Hospital near Turin in Italy in the late 1930s, helping to establish the institution as a pioneering and influential center for the practice of leucotomy, a form of psychosurgery in Italy. Basically, a lobotomy. It's sort of just another name for it. Now this narrative arc from skepticism to acceptance illustrates the complex and evolving perspectives on the role of surgery in treating mental illness. It was certainly a period of significant experimentation and debate within the medical community. Now, here comes the main character. In 1935, António Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist who also coined the term psychosurgery, embarked on the first proper leucotomy, aiming to explore surgical solutions for mental illnesses. His interest in the somatic treatment of psychiatric conditions had been growing since the early 1930s, presenting him with a new avenue for the recognition through the development of a brain surgery method to treat mental disorders. Everything was so new and exciting. The rationale behind Moniz's focus on the frontal lobes for his pioneering psychosurgery efforts is shrouded in various accounts and retrospective explanations. One significant influence was the work of John Fulton, who was a neuroscientist from Yale, particularly highlighted by an event at the Second International Congress of Neurology in London in 1935, which Moniz, of course, attended. Can't miss that one if you're a neuroscientist. Fulton, alongside his colleague Carlisle Jacobson, showcased the effects of frontal lobectomies on two chimpanzees, named Becky and Lucy, by the way, demonstrating marked behavior and cognitive changes post-surgery. Becky, known for her emotional outbursts and frustration behaviors during experiments, exhibited a dramatic transformation, becoming significantly calmer. I'm so sorry, I have an ex-girlfriend called Becky, and it's just, yeah. I do apologize. Now, Jacobson was humorously described as joining a happiness cult. So basically, the one named Becky had become very docile and almost zombified, which they said was significantly calmer. And Jacobson was just off with the fairies, it seems. This presentation had a profound impact on Moniz, who questioned Fulton about the feasibility of applying this surgical approach to humans with mental illnesses. Fulton acknowledged the theoretical possibility, but emphasized the formidable nature of such an intervention for human patients. Now, this interaction, whether directly influential or not, marked a pivotal moment in the history of psychosurgery, setting the stage for Moniz to pursue leucotomy as a treatment for mental disorders, a decision which would of course have far-reaching implications in the field of neurology and psychiatry. Just 3 months after being inspired at the Congress, where the transformative effects of the frontal lobe interventions on chimpanzees were showcased by Fulton and Jacobson, Moniz initiated his pioneering experiments. This event suggested a direct influence on Fulton's work on Moniz's decisions to focus on frontal lobes for his surgical explorations. Fulton, occasionally hailed as the progenitor of lobotomy, later suggested that this technique originated from his laboratory. This narrative was echoed in 1949 by Stanley Cobb, who marveled at the swift and dramatic application of a laboratory observation to clinical practice. However, the accuracy of Fulton's account, especially the public exchange with Moniz, is debated, as it lacks corroborative evidence and differs from Fulton's earlier unpublished recollections. Moniz himself had confided in his colleague Pedro Almeida Lima about his psychosurgical concepts as early as 1933. This indicates a pre-existing interest in the operation well before his trip to London. So this is why we generally consider Moniz to be the godfather of lobotomies, rather than the other two, as much as that title is not widely coveted. The focus on frontal lobes wasn't solely due to Fulton's research. It was the culmination of decades of scientific curiosity and exploration. And this really was the golden age of scientific exploration. Just ask the Germans. The late 19th and earliest 20th centuries saw extensive inquiry into these brain regions, initially deemed the silent lobe due to the lack of observable effects from surgical or electrical interventions in animal studies. This perception evolved post-World War I, with increased clinical reports of behavioral changes in patients with frontal lobe damage and advancements in neurosurgical techniques, leading to a richer understanding of the lobe's significance. Conditions like Witzelsucht, characterized by excessive joking and a childlike demeanor, highlighted the behavioral implications of frontal lobe damage. The Germans really do have a word for everything, don't they? Leonardo Bianchi's work in the early 20th century, despite its experimental limitations, further reinforced the critical role of the frontal lobes in personality and cognitive functions, setting the stage for Moniz's exploratory surgery in a quest to address the mental illness through psychosurgery. This historical journey reflects the complex interplay of medical theory, experimental findings, and clinical practice that shaped this new and controversial field of psychosurgery. In 1930, a pivotal moment in the exploration of the frontal lobes occurred when Walter Dandy, an American neurosurgeon, performed the first bilateral lobectomy on a human. This human was known as Patient A. Richard Brickner later reported in 1932 that this patient, despite a dulled emotional response, maintained normal intellectual capabilities, leading to the conclusion that the frontal lobes were not the seat of intellect. This case, alongside another similar operation by Roy Glenwood Sperling in 1934, contributed to a burgeoning interest in the frontal lobe's role by the mid-1930s. This period of intense scrutiny culminated in the 1935 Neurological Congress in London, highlighted by a significant symposium dedicated to discussing the functions of the frontal lobes specifically. It was here Henry Claude posited that the alterations to the frontal lobes could profoundly affect personality, a notion that caught António Egas Moniz's attention, particularly through Brickner's presentation on Patient A. By the time of this Congress, Moniz was not alone in his interest in the frontal lobes. Various medical professionals had previously considered direct interventions on this brain region, albeit cautiously due to the associated risks. However, influenced by the earlier success of malarial therapy for general paresis, Maurice Ducoste and others experimented with injecting malarial blood directly into the frontal lobe of patients, reporting notable improvements. Concurrently, in Switzerland, François Audy performed a radical procedure by removing the entire right frontal lobe of a catatonic schizophrenic patient, a technique that was later replicated in Romania. This period marked a daring era of experimental treatments targeting the frontal lobes, and it was all driven by a mix of curiosity and hope, and of course the pursuit of therapeutic breakthroughs. No doubt there were a few strange people who expressed their interest in performing these kinds of operations purely for their alleged medical advancement. Yeah, I don't believe that. Despite the diverse approaches and outcomes, these endeavors collectively underscored the frontal lobe's critical influence on personality and mental health. We were learning about the brain, albeit through very nefarious means and haphazard techniques. Moniz's subsequent development of leucotomy, inspired by these pioneering efforts and the supportive backdrop of existing research, propelled the field into new, controversial territories of psychosurgery. You see, some 50 years prior, you would have been seen as a butcher, a psychopath for doing these sorts of things. But with a little bit of peer-reviewed journals and sprinkle on some scientific optimism, well, one can get away with performing any kind of medical procedure. After all, is it not simply for the greater good? António Egas Moniz's venture into psychosurgery was underpinned by the theoretical ideas that, while innovative, echoed the 19th century concepts that had originally guided Burckhardt's pioneering operations. Despite referencing contemporary neuroscientific advances, like Raymond E. Kayal's neuron theory, and Ivan Pavlov's work on conditioned reflexes, Moniz essentially reframed these insights within the older framework of associationism, a theory positing that mental processes result from the connections between ideas. Moniz's departure from Burckhardt's approach was marked by his belief that mental illnesses did not stem from any physical defect within the brain structure. Instead, his theory was that the issue lay in the brain's neural pathways instead, which he thought became trapped in harmful repetitive patterns that led to obsessive and dominant thoughts. Moniz posited in 1936 that mental disorders were linked to the formation of stable cellulo-connective networks, suggesting that while the cells themselves and their axons might remain physically unchanged, it was the rigid patterns of their connections, differing significantly from the more variable arrangements in healthy individuals, that were associated with persistent delusions and other symptoms of mental illness. He argued that the treatment for such conditions involved disrupting these stable neural connections, particularly in the frontal lobes, to eradicate the patient's entrenched pathological circuits. Moniz maintained that the brain could adapt functionally to such disruptions, indicating a belief in the brain's inherent plasticity. Now, this theoretical foundation set Moniz's work apart from Burckhardt's earlier efforts. Moniz's stuff was on another level and had a bit more of an intellectual flair to it. And there was a lot more research from others that was peer-reviewed that tended to back up his claims. While Burckhardt had focused on removing physical brain matter in response to assumed organic pathologies, Moniz targeted what he saw as a dysfunctional neural circuitry, without necessarily identifying any physical abnormalities. His hypothesis, firmly rooted in the conceptual frameworks of his time, was not directly testable with the scientific methods and technologies when it was available. This made his thesis unfalsifiable. You couldn't really prove it right, but you couldn't really prove it wrong either, as the lack of identifiable physical brain pathology in mental illnesses could neither confirm nor contradict his views on the neural basis of psychiatric disorders. On November 12, 1935, at Lisbon's Hospital Santa Marta, Moniz commenced a groundbreaking series of brain operations on mental illness patients, with the procedures carried out by Pedro Almeida Lima, due to Moniz's lack of surgical training and physical limitations. These initial operations aimed to disrupt connections within the frontal lobes by injecting ethanol into the brain's subcortical white matter to sever the long fibers linking the frontal lobe to the brain's other regions, creating a frontal barrier. Despite considering the first operation a success, the technique evolved from ethanol injections to the use of a leucotomy, a surgical tool designed to make precise lesions in the brain. For the 9th patient onwards, facilitating more targeted interventions. So they stopped using ethanol, and now it was more of a little more invasive. By February 1936, 20 patients had undergone this new experimental procedure, leading Moniz to swiftly publish his findings. The patients, ranging from 27 to 62 years old, presented a variety of mental health conditions, including depression, schizophrenia, and panic disorder, among others. Despite the rapid turnover from operation to discharge and a brief follow-up period, complications were noted, including physical and psychological side effects, though Moniz deemed these transient. In his assessment, 35% of patients showed significant improvement. Another 35% showed some improvement, and the remaining 30% remained unchanged, with no fatalities reported. That's pretty good. This initial phase of leucotomies marked a controversial yet pivotal moment in the treatment of mental illnesses, reflecting both the potential risks and the rapid advancements of early psychosurgery. Moniz was quick to share his findings on leucotomy with the medical world through articles and a monograph published in 1936. Despite this rapid dissemination, the initial reaction from the medical community was understandably largely skeptical. At a presentation in Paris by Moniz's assistant, Diogo Furtado, detailing the outcomes of a second patient group treated with leucotomy, criticism was voiced prominently by José de Matos Sobral Cid, who had referred patients for the initial procedures. He criticized the technique, suggesting it led to a diminished state and personality degradation in patients, attributing any observed changes to shock and brain injury rather than a therapeutic success. He then dismissed Moniz's theoretical framework as cerebral mythology. Ouch. Paul Corbon, a Parisian psychiatrist at the same meeting, expressed reluctance to show a method grounded more in theory than in clinical evidence, cautioning against the potential for harmful consequences like meningitis, epilepsy, and brain abscesses following such invasive surgery. Well, despite these rather well-advised objections, the reported improvement of 14 out of the initial 20 patients treated with leucotomy spurred its experimental adoption across various countries, including Brazil, Cuba, Italy, Romania, and eventually the United States, all the way throughout the 1930s. This period marked the beginning of leucotomy's controversial yet influential journey in psychiatric treatment. In the United States, the practice of lobotomy reached a significant scale, with around 40,000 individuals undergoing the procedure. In England, the number of lobotomies performed was around 17,000. The Nordic countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden saw approximately 9,300 lobotomies combined, with the rate of lobotomy per capita in these countries being 2.5 times higher than in the US. Specifically, Sweden reported at least 4,500 lobotomies between 1944 and 1966, predominantly among young women, including young children. Norway accounted for 2,000 lobotomies, while Denmark saw about 4,500 procedures. In Japan, lobotomies were unfortunately mainly conducted on children presenting with behavioral issues, which is perhaps the most horrifying sentence I've read in this video so far. However, the Soviet Union, well, they took a stand against lobotomy, banning it in 1950, citing moral reasons, while in Germany, the procedure was rarely performed. By the late 1970s, the practice of lobotomy had largely fallen out of favor worldwide, though it persisted until the 1980s in France, believe it or not. The journey of lobotomy in medical history has been marked by rapid shifts in acceptance and controversy. Early critiques highlighted its risks, particularly in treating schizophrenia, noting the procedure's crudeness and lack of clear guidelines for its use. Notable figures like Norbert Wiener criticized lobotomy for simplifying patient care at the expense of the patient's well-being, suggesting that it was favored for making custodial care easier. Of course, it's easier to look after patients in a psychiatric facility if they are all effectively vegetables. Now, as we said about the Soviet Union, Vasily Giliarovsky banned lobotomy. That was the main psychiatrist, my goodness, who was leading the movement in the 1950s. Well, they cited its inhumane and unethical practice as reasons to ban it, and pretty much everybody agreed. The sentiment began to spread across various countries and some US states by the 1970s. In 1977, the US Congress, amidst concerns about psychosurgery's potential misuse, found that, when properly conducted, it may have some benefits, though debate over the ethical implications continued. Now, fun fact about Moniz. He was rewarded a Nobel Prize for his work. Now that's a bit of a shocker, isn't it? The Nobel Prize awarded to Moniz for his role in developing lobotomy has of course been a subject of significant controversy, with quite a few in the medical community calling this a grave mistake. Despite calls for the Nobel Foundation to rescind the prize, it has maintained its stance. That's right. They still award him with the Nobel Prize for his work and research. Bit awkward, isn't it? This certainly reflects the complex legacy of the lobotomy within the medical and ethical landscape of the 20th century. I suppose as we end this video, we have to reflect on what we've learned and think, how far are we willing to stretch our morality towards other people in order for scientific progress? I also feel bad for those 2 chimpanzees that were subject to the procedure as early as the 1930s. Horrible. Well, with that, our video for today comes to a close. Before I go, I'd like to give a shout out to Stark Factory, who has become a Mega Chad tier member on the Patreon. Thank you very much, Stark Factory. I know you're out there listening, and I appreciate your support. If you'd like to become a member of the Patreon, follow the links in the comments, or just keep enjoying the content. That's fine by me. Thank you very much for listening. And try not to become the victim of medical experimentation anytime soon, please. Good night, everybody. See you next time.